Top of page 82. As already described, the original state of God is that state of unbounded, absolute vacuum where God is and consciousness is not. This state is the original divine sound sleep state of God beyond the beginning of creation. The original infinite whim of God, as the cause, is responsible for breaking the spell of the original divine sound sleep state of God, and the result, which is creation, is called the effect. In order to grasp clearly the divine sound sleep state and understand more clearly all that follows immediately after the original infinite whim surges in God, bestirring him from the divine sound sleep. Let the divine sound sleep state of God be compared with the sound sleep of man. This sound sleep state of man is literally the same original divine sound sleep state of God. God in the God is state is eternally in the original divine sound sleep state, whereas God in the human state daily experiences alternately the sound sleep state and the awake state. The infinite, impressionless, and formless, eternal God experiences himself as finite, limited, inanimate or animate forms or beings only because of the advent of the first most finite impression of the nothing that manifested as nothingness. At one stage in the evolution of consciousness, the impressions of the nothing impart to God the experiences of the human state. These impressions of the nothing are just the procreation of the original most finite first impression picked up by the most finite first ray of consciousness in God, made manifest simultaneously when the latent original infinite whim surged in God and projected the latent all of the most finite nothing as nothingness. The original most finite impression multiplied and increased simultaneously and concurrently with the evolution of the most finite original trickle of consciousness. The multifarious and varied impressions so formed were experienced by the greater evolution of consciousness through multifarious and varied media of finite or gross forms, because the impressions formed must necessarily be experienced by the consciousness. But for consciousness to experience the impressions, suitable media were absolutely necessary. Thus, the evolution of consciousness goes on evolving further and greater consciousness in conformity with the evolution of gross forms of relatively higher and higher types, in order to experience the impressions gathered in conjunction with the preceding, relatively lower types of gross media. In short, the most finite first impression of the original infinite whim surging in God gave to the unconscious infinite God the most finite consciousness. Gradually, varied impressions multiplied and increased and gained greater finite consciousness for God, until eventually the evolution of consciousness was complete when the impressions of full consciousness gained identified God with human form. God having now gained full consciousness in human form, the need no longer persists for additional or higher forms to evolve consciousness, as this consciousness gained is full and complete. During the process of the evolution of consciousness, the consciousness, while identifying God consciously with varied finite gross forms, inanimate and animate, was also simultaneously, though unconsciously, identifying God with his limited subtle form and his limited mental form. These forms associated with the limited gross form of God in compact and homogeneous unconscious association throughout the process of evolution of consciousness from the very advent of the first original projection of the latent nothing in everything. These forms associated with the limited gross form of God in compact and homogeneous unconscious association throughout the process of evolution of consciousness from the very advent of the first original projection of the latent nothing in everything. These forms associated with the limited gross form of God in compact and homogeneous unconscious association throughout the process of evolution of consciousness from the very advent of the first original projection of the latent nothing in everything. It is but natural that, together with the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of God, the evolution of the limited and finite subtle and mental forms simultaneously takes place, till in human gross form the limited subtle and mental forms of God are fully developed. Though God has gained full consciousness in human form, and though the limited subtle and mental forms are also fully developed in human form, yet the full consciousness so gained is only of the gross, which gives experience only of the gross world. Hence, the fully gained consciousness is not yet conscious of the subtle and mental forms, nor does it consciously experience the subtle and mental worlds. In short, though God in the human state has gained full and complete consciousness, he is still not conscious of his limited energy of the subtle form, nor of his limited mind of the mental form. Much less is he aware or conscious of himself as the one indivisible, eternal, and infinite God, with unbounded power and unlimited knowledge. At this stage, God is only fully conscious of his identity with human form and its varied gross aspects, and experiences in full only the gross world as an ordinary human being of the world in the form of man or woman. But the consciousness of man, together with his mental form as the mind, his subtle form as energy, and his gross form as the body, are all the outcome of the manifestation of the most finite nothing as infinite nothingness, which was latent in the God-is state. In other words, the limited mind, the limited energy, and the finite body are all of the nothing, and the consciousness of the limited mind, the limited energy, and the finite body is also of the nothing. In man, the mind is the seat of desires and thoughts. Energy is the seat of force and vigor. And the body, typifying happiness, is the seat of happiness and misery. Hence, these desires and thoughts, force and vigor, happiness and misery, are respectively the finite aspects of the limited mind, energy, and body of man. Although these aspects of the finite basis of the triple nature of man, the mind, the energy, and the body, typifying happiness, are finite, due to the fact that they are the outcome of manifestation of the most finite nothing. Yet these finite aspects of mind, energy, and body demonstrate their capabilities ad infinitum. This is because each of these finite bases of the triple nature of man, the energy, the mind, and the body, typifying happiness, is closely linked with and upheld by each of the three infinite bases of the trio nature of God. Sat Chit Anand, infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss. The fact is that when the latent infinite trio nature of God is gradually manifested out of the gradual projection of the finite nothing, and when it simultaneously protrudes the projection of the finite nothing as nothingness, manifested ad infinitum, this very same infinite trio nature of God, at this stage of manifestation, becomes enmeshed in the apparent and false infinity of the nothingness, and thus gets itself expressed as the finite triple nature of God, of man, with capabilities demonstrated ad infinitum. How 1, the mind, 2, the energy, and 3, the body, as the triple nature of man, demonstrate their capabilities ad infinitum in illusion is clearly experienced. 1, through the inventive mind of a scientist who finds no end to discoveries and inventions. 2, through the release of nuclear energy in illusion, which has reached a stage where it threatens with its own force of illusion to destroy the very nothingness out of which it emerged and evolved into such a terrific force. 3, through the body, typifying happiness, which now, keeping pace with the advanced progress of the evolution of the nothing, is infinitely urged to seek greater and greater happiness to such an extent that happiness actually becomes the very basis of the life of illusion. The only reason for such infinite demonstration in the field of nothingness, which is illusion, is because the basic finite triple nature of man, energy, mind, and happiness of nothingness, is upheld and stretched out ad infinitum by the basic infinite trio nature of God, infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss of everything. Infinite power is unbounded and is never reduced nor exhausted, whereas finite energy, though linked with infinite power, is reduced and exhausted because it is only the outcome of the nothing manifested as the finite energy of nothingness. Infinite knowledge is eternal, uniform, and all-pervading, and therefore is without a break in its continuity. The limited mind, however, though linked with infinite knowledge, is annihilated and made to vanish ultimately because it is the outcome of the nothing, manifested as the finite mind of nothingness. Infinite bliss is bliss eternal and continual, and because it is perpetual, it is without any opposite aspect. Happiness, on the other hand, although linked with infinite bliss, is not perpetual, and therefore it has an opposite aspect of misery. This finite happiness vanishes, even though it is the very basis of the life of the human being, because life itself is transient. As the life of illusion is the outcome of the nothing, manifested as the life of nothingness, this life must perish. A stage is reached when man in his travail to realize God ultimately loses his basic finite triple nature. That is body, typifying happiness, energy and mind, and realizes the basic infinite trio nature of bliss, power, and knowledge. In this state, man experiences that his nature is not the finite body, typifying happiness, but is infinite bliss. Not the finite energy, but infinite power. Not the finite mind, but infinite knowledge. Thus, man loses his basic finite triple nature and realizes that his is the basic infinite trio nature of God. This means that the basic finite triple nature of man, which was upheld by the basic infinite trio nature of God, is unlinked from the basic infinite trio nature of God. Although the man loses his basic finite triple nature, the full consciousness that he gained in his travail is not lost, because full consciousness once gained is never lost, except in gross misuse of the powers of the fourth plane, as previously described. In this state, with consciousness intact and complete, the limited and finite body, typifying happiness, the limited and finite energy, and the limited and finite mind are all totally unlinked from the unlimited and infinite bliss, power, and knowledge, respectively. This is the stage when man is fully conscious and yet no longer experiences the false finite nothingness as real and infinite. The body, typifying happiness, energy and mind, which were instrumental in giving the experience of the nothingness, no longer grip the consciousness of man with finite impressions. These are now unlinked and have simply vanished from the focus of the consciousness. They must vanish because they were of the finite nothing by nature, which literally means absolutely nothing. But before body, energy, and mind ultimately lose their grip over the consciousness of man, there is one predominant experience which he has in his everyday life, that of sleeping and waking each day. This fundamental experience in a normal man gives rise to three basic states in his everyday life. The first state is the sound sleep state, or the state of complete unconsciousness of the self in man. The second state is the dream state, or the semi-conscious or semi-awake state. The third state is the completely awake state, or the state of complete consciousness of the self in man as man. Now, man's cognizance is life in man, and man's life is made cognizant through the actions of man. Actions are generated by the impressions of man and vice versa. These impressions of man are picked up and imprinted on the mind of man by actions. Impressions and actions are thus interdependent because impressions are fed by actions and actions are motivated by impressions. As said previously, the source of impressions is traced as far back as the latent nothing in the everything, which means God in the God-is state. When the nothing first became manifested as nothingness in the shape of creation, the primal manifestation of the nothing gave rise to the first trace of consciousness in man, and hereupon the first impression of nothingness manifested. This first impression procreated impressions with the evolution of consciousness. Accordingly, all impressions are of the nothing, and as nothing literally means nothing, these impressions are naturally nothing but mere impressions. But because it was through these very impressions of nothing that consciousness evolved fully and completely in man, the consciousness of man is closely linked with these impressions of nothing, and makes man consciously experience this false nothing as everything and real. Impressions, as such, play a vital role in the life of man, until such time as they are completely wiped away, relieving and freeing consciousness from experiencing the false nothing as everything and real. Consciousness, when relieved of all impressions, will no longer experience the false nothing as real, but it will experience reality as the unlimited self, i.e., God. As long as impressions persist and continue to impress the consciousness of man, these impressions, activated and generated by the energy of man, are being constantly imprinted on the mind of man and are being retained or stored in the subconsciousness. Some of these impressions remain dormant in the subconsciousness of man for hours or days or years, and sometimes for lifetimes. But most of them get projected through the subconsciousness of man every moment of his life, while he experiences semi-conscious and fully conscious states, that is, the dream and awake states respectively. Top of page 88.